Amateur Radio Callsign for life. It happened suddenly in late July 2019. How did it happen, and what was some of the background behind it? In this video, I'll try and answer those questions, as well as reflect on the quality of amateur radio representation in Australia. Who has been proven most effective? The WIA, RASA, or maybe even another group? The answer may surprise you. I should point out that this video only came about due to a Freedom of Information request. It's similar in structure to a video I did on the amateur exam system, and in particular the delays that it suffered during much of last year. Unlike that time though, I did not put in this Freedom of Information request. This was put in by someone else. I don't know who. It all starts about 18 months ago. Foundation amateurs got increased privileges, including digital modes. The only problem was that their four-letter suffixes, beginning with F, were unsuitable for some of them due to the longer call signs. So the drive was on to get more suitable call signs for Foundation amateurs. I did a video on the 21st of September 2019 on changes to the Australian licence conditions, so if you want to learn more, watch that video. In early October, the Radio Amateur Society of Australia recommended a VJ prefix for Foundation amateurs. Also, they wanted a cross-sector committee that comprised WIA representatives and possibly others to provide a unified front to represent amateur radio in Australia. That's been a consistent theme of their advocacy for quite some time. However, such a committee could only work if there is goodwill between all parties, and as you'll see later on, that cannot be taken for granted. Also, as will become another pattern, RASA was the first organisation out of it and the WIA to respond to various proposals. ACMA met with the WIA on the 11th of November 2019. The minutes are included in the FOI material, but most of it is redacted. The bit that was kept public were WIA's concerns about the robustness of RASA's survey. Just to put you in the picture, RASA set up a survey on its website using SurveyMonkey to survey amateurs on their preferred options for Foundation licence call signs. The WIA expressed concerns about the robustness of that survey. Another term that will become familiar is that the ACMA described call sign policy as non-regulatory. They wanted stakeholders to cooperate or mount evidence-based cases. They wanted the WIA to re-engage with RASA, and in this case it seems that the ACMA wanted WIA to bring solutions to it. ACMA didn't want to play umpire between warring factions. And if you thought the title to this video was a bit sensationalist, the word warring is used at least once in the material seen. And again, we've got the ACMA saying it's not their role to adjudicate between quarrelling people. It looks as if there are some changes and someone new started at the ACMA, or at least in a new position. Anyway, in a letter of introduction, RASA's Glenn Dunstan, who's their president, introduces himself, and it's quite a long letter, 4 pages long. It describes the WIA as obstructive, their own RASA survey as being good, and suggests that we should implement the VJ prefix for Foundation amateurs. Now imagine if you were starting in a new job and you got that letter. You'd really be wondering what you walked into. And you might be wondering about the stakeholder groups that your organisation has to deal with. On November 21, ACMA emailed WIA, again saying call signs is not a regulatory matter, and mention their preference is to get the amateur community to agree and reach some consensus, including potentially re-engaging with RASA. That may be easier said than done, given that RASA is basically a breakaway group of ex-WIA officials. RASA wanted to hurry ACMA up. This is in an email on the 26th of November, and they were again critical of the WIA, and again reaffirming their survey was great and that the VJ prefix should be applied for Foundation amateurs. But not everyone supported RASA's stance. For instance, there was an email from a Foundation amateur who wanted to know what was going on. They've got all these extra digital modes, but their call sign was hobbling them from using some of them. Anyway, they wanted a solution that had call signs that were like the rest of us, i.e. VKs, and not tied up with license level. So they didn't like RASA's approach, but they did want faster action from ACMA. On the 5th of December, RASA again proposed to ACMA a WIA RASA cross-sector committee, as they call it, and they suggested that the committee work on AMC not accepting the divided view. So there had to be consensus, and consultation with amateurs should be done via this committee. But as I mentioned before, that requires cooperation, and given some of the things that had been said by various bodies against each other, could be quite difficult to achieve. And then there was the ACMA stance. They basically tell the RASA and the WIA to sort out their own problems, and ACMA didn't want its actions to be limited by this committee. So that brings us to December 2019, and over that summer, not much happened. However, during this time, the WIA was doing its own survey, and on the 12th of March, they sent ACMA the results of that survey. That survey favoured non-class 3-letter call signs for all. The WIA poll had over 2,000 votes, but what it doesn't tell you is the member versus non-member split. It probably should have done, because then you would have a better idea of how representative it was. By the 17th of March, there are some internal ACMA emails on the WIA survey where they described the method as being robust. They also liked the approach of the classless call sign system and thought that it was better from the point of view of efficiencies. But ACMA was still concerned about criticism, and there is even the possibility of ACMA doing its own survey. The benefit of ACMA doing its own survey was that they could rely on their own results and not those of the warring factions. Yep, that's what they say, warring factions. So they were basically competing surveys, one from RASA saying one thing, and one from the WIA recommending another. Now, RASA wasn't very happy about this, as it seemed that the tide was going out for them, and they sent an email off to ACMA pointing out what they saw as flaws in the WIA survey. They included opting in, a flawed method, and a bias towards a particular option. And RASA reaffirmed its statement that its survey was better and that we should go with the VJ prefix option for Foundation amateurs. ACMA were also not very impressed. They thought that competing surveys was not how we consider appropriate cross-sector engagement. But overall they supported the WIA approach, but they didn't consider it a high priority and didn't want to do anything without agreement from the amateur community. And by this time we were around 6 months from when Foundation licensees got their expanded privileges. ACMA went back to both amateur associations, WIA and RASA, emails to both their presidents. They said they were disappointed that the amateur groups couldn't agree. They said the surveys had been of some use, but they'll go with the WIA option. They again say it's administrative policy rather than regulation, and for that consultation is desirable. Also on the 30th of March, ACMA rebuked RASA for disclosing an email. It shouldn't have gone out, but RASA put it out as a news release and it got everyone all excited. All the new call signs, that was all going to happen, and Foundation licensees would get new call signs and possibly others. Anyway, as it turned out, people weren't ready and no one was prepared to implement at this stage, so it was very premature that it came out. The ACMA put out a release to clarify its position, and that was read out on the WIA Sunday News in early April. So it looks like a bit of a story of the hare and the tortoise. RASA could be described as the hare, it being earlier to act, whereas the WIA was slower. But in the end, in relation to this particular issue, it was the WIA's approach that seemed to get most support from the ACMA. That is 3-letter VK call sign suffixes not tied to license level. And in other things you'll find it's a fairly common pattern. RASA is often the first to respond and the WIA takes quite a bit more time, as a general rule. Anyway, RASA were fairly disappointed at all this, but they said they will abide by ACMA's decision regarding call sign structure, not as if they had a choice, but they did say, and to quote them, enmity must stop, and mentioning that 5 months were wasted in relation to the new call signs. They reiterated their desire for a cross-sector committee with representatives from both organisations to provide a coordinated input into the next FYSO, which is basically their next program that ACMA works on, their work program. I think it's a 5-year spectrum outlook. There's some internal emails flying around ACMA saying that RASA has been a bit frustrating and that both the WIA and RASA surveys were described as disharmonious and complex. And then later on they said that the WIA had understood the steps in the process, but Mr. Dunstan, who's the RASA president, had taken it upon himself to report our communication, and in doing so has jumped the gun. So that is probably not great for trust between ACMA and a stakeholder organisation. On the other hand, if you look at contact between RASA and the ACMA, there's much more contact, it's more frequent. It seems to also involve quite a few phone calls than between WIA and ACMA. And the other thing that Mr. Dunstan has going for him is that he's also sometimes in touch with the ACMA with his other hat, and that is being as advisor to AMC on various amateur exam and call sign matters. Anyway, ACMA says that it's not our intention to publicise the outcome of the process until we had a definite outcome to report, which they hadn't as yet because they hadn't even discussed it with the AMC. And of course that was an issue that was to later become a problem because of the big rush of applications for new call signs. Anyway, ACMA says it will go with the WIA option, the classless call sign for life, and they're just concerned about a bit of possible objection. ACMA recognise they can't please everyone, but the option that they have chosen is likely to have some efficiency gains. And because this was being made public through the RASA website, there are quite a few people that were emailing in to ACMA, and there's a standard few paragraphs that ACMA sent to people that were inquiring. So, by the time of the 2nd of April 2020, ACMA were ready to advise AMC of the preferred option. It's described as classless or call signs for life, and then there are some dot points in practical terms what it would mean. And very significantly, as you'll find later on, which we'll discuss further, I want to highlight a point. Licensees moving interstate would still be required to obtain a new call sign indicating their state or territory, when they change the address details on their license with the ACMA. So just remember that. The other thing that is ACMA is responsible for callsign policy, so communications on this matter will be done by them, not AMC. There was an email from a confused amateur sent on the 2nd of April 2020, and it was over the callsign issue. And anyway, on the 5th of April 2020, the WIA Sunday broadcast had ACMA's advice that it was still being worked out, contrary to material published by RASA. And although the broadcast is dated April the 5th, which is a Sunday, the text normally comes out on the Friday, that is April the 3rd. Anyway, RASA had obviously read that, and so on April the 4th came out with a statement that didn't admit that they had jumped the gun, but the statement went on to mention other things like RASA being unhappy with amateur disunity and blaming WIA for non-cooperation. And RASA went on to say, though, that they had a productive 30-minute phone call with the WIA president, but a hostile email from its secretary. So they make an observation about the WIA like there are two separate management structures within it. So their view is that there's not even necessarily consensus within the WIA board on its relationship with RASA. Now, 9th of April, the WIA president supports the ACMA approach, which is not surprising, given the ACMA support of the WIA's survey option. The only concern was an appearance of conflict of interest, as RASA president also advises AMC. On the 14th of April 2020, the ACMA got a question from RASA on interstate moves. It was previously unclear. Most amateurs, when they did move interstate, did get a new call sign, but there's been a bit of ambiguity, not helped by amateurs themselves. Anyway, the ACMA moved to amend their advice to the customer service centre so that when people ring up or email, they should get the right advice now, and that advice is, and I quote, "The ACMA does not require amateur licensees to obtain a new call sign when they move interstate. They still have to tell them if their address has changed, but they don't need to take out a new call sign." So that's the word from the ACMA. However, it was a bit ambiguous and some other documents had said different things. And the background to this was that Glenn got a query from an amateur moving interstate who was told by ACMA that they did need to change their call sign. So ACMA have cleared that up in relation to what people are told. So that was all in the middle of April. There was a flurry around late March, early April, and then things seemed to go quiet until the middle of June. And of course, there is a little thing called COVID sweeping the country. Anyway, on the 16th of June, there is a proposal from AMC about effectively scrapping call areas. So it included grouping VK1s to 8 for all applications, including presumably new applications, but retaining VK0 and VK9 as special. Now, the material here talks about them as being different DXCC countries, which is true, but it's actually a bit more complex than that, because if you look at Christmas Island and Norfolk Island, both VK9s, they're different for DXCC. Now, there was a custom where the first letter of the suffix after the VK9 helped to differentiate the islands. Anyway, if I get this right, it meant that you could get any VK1 to VK8 call sign first up, no matter where you lived. Now, there were some concerns in the ACMA over this. It was thought that not having a geographic identifier at all for future call sign allocations will generate concern amongst the amateur community. And then there's a mention that relying on WIA and RASA to provide a consensus view has to date caused us much anxiety, as they only represent 1/3 of the amateur community. So that's not exactly a vote of confidence in the ability of either representative body to faithfully represent the views of mainstream VK amateurs. Now, another thing I wanted to pick up on is the ACMA saying that WIA and RASA collectively only represent a third of the amateur community. So basically, their membership ratio as a percentage of the total amateur population. So that view is based on direct membership. Now, the WIA takes a slightly different view. Now, if we look at part of the WIA's website, I'll quote, "The Wireless Institute of Australia is today a member of the International Amateur Radio Union and represents all amateur radio operators in Australia to the various government bodies in this country." So the WIA is basically saying that even if you're not a member, it represents you. Hence, their view on representation is a bit more expansive than the ACMA's, which says, no, if you're not a member, it doesn't represent you. A body only represents its members. And this calls into question the legitimacy of various bodies that seek to represent the amateur movement. Do they represent just their members, as the ACMA thinks, or all amateurs? On the 19th of June, ACMA write to AMC about callsign allocations. They basically tell them what's going to be done, and that foundation licensees or new foundation licensees will get 3-letter callsigns starting with VK, and apart from 2-letter suffixes, the whole thing will be classless, with no need to change callsigns if you upgrade. But there would continue to be geographic identifiers for newly issued callsigns. But, as was already made clear, amateurs moving interstate would not be compelled to change their callsign. And there would be an interim new template created to support that. And of note is that the email says that it's to be regarded as confidential between ACMA and AMC until the callsign template is sorted out. However, the RASA president, as he was advisor to AMC, also saw it, as confirmed by him seeking clarification on one aspect a few minutes later. So that was the 19th of June. And in deepest, darkest Tasmania winter, things move slowly. And so it wasn't until the 16th of July that there is a response from AMC to ACMA on the callsign templates. And AMC have consulted and agree with ACMA's proposed amendments. And these callsign tables would have to go into the deed, which in turn would have to be amended. And so, on the 29th of July, it was all ready to go public. ACMA released a bulletin on callsign changes. I made a video at the time, there's a link to it below, so I suggest you watch it if you need clarification. Very soon after that amateur bulletin went out from the ACMA, there is an email to them from the Scouts Association in Victoria. They were concerned about Scouts and Guide callsign suffixes and whether they were being released to the general public rather than being reserved. Historically, you needed a letter from the Scouts or Guides to get certain callsigns. And the reply from the ACMA, dated the 3rd of August, was that those callsigns were no longer special and were released into the general block, meaning that anyone could get them. The Scouts replied, saying that was a big change, but as you'll find out, this will soon be tested. And this matter went on to produce quite a lot of correspondence. Meanwhile, as soon as all this went public, there is a huge increase in business for the AMC. There were lots of people making phone calls, and so there had to be 2 people put on to answer the emails and 2 people to focus on the core business of administering exams and callsign processing. I'm not going to go onto this too much here, I can just refer you to my video I did a while ago talking about the AMC and the callsign backlog. Now there are other things updated, for instance the frequently asked questions. There is an extra question put on about moving interstate. It being clarified, no, you don't have to change your call sign if you move interstate. Just advise the ACMA of your new address. And we mentioned scouts and guides before. Here's the new template that didn't have provision for them. And what about feedback to ACMA? Overall, 50% good, 50% bad. They reckon that's a good result for amateurs. Often people are more likely to complain than to offer praise. So I think that's what they go by. There's a silent majority who accept the changes or are happy with them. There was one letter asking about two-letter suffixes, whether people other than advanced amateurs could get them, and no change was recommended, and ACMA believe that that is consistent with amateur views, that two-letter suffixes should just be for advanced amateurs. Something else was that when it first came out, the advice from ACMA said that foundation amateurs could keep their F call even if upgrading. Anyway, in his capacity as advisor to AMC, Glenn Dunstan emailed suggesting a change. The effect of this is to require upgrading F calls to get a three-letter suffix call sign. That would help phase out the four-letter suffixes and, if I'm not being too rude, increase revenue for AMC because of the greater number of call sign changes. Getting back to scouts, in communication with ACMA, they were told they no longer had their call sign blocks as exclusive. And then there is some concern about breaches of conditions. If people were no longer identified on the air by their license category in their call sign, and the reply from ACMA was basically that if you believe someone was operating outside their license conditions, then tell them, and they'll do enforcement action within the context of our compliance and enforcement priorities. Scouts were still concerned, and on the 8th of September 2020, they sent an email justifying why they should hang on to their existing call sign allocations, and the email went on to talk about various Scout radio and electronics activities. This got a favourable reception from the ACMA, and so they reverted to the previous arrangements of exclusive Scout and Girl Guide call signs. So that was an example of ACMA being very prescriptive in relation to call sign suffixes. Meanwhile, VK3YE wrote an email to ACMA about the call signs. He basically wanted to keep state-based numbered designations for amateur call signs, and especially for the benefit of international stations, but also others as well. It was often useful for amateurs to know their rough location by their call sign for things like pointing antennas and the like. Anyway, ACMA replied to him and says that the call sign structure is not a key concern of the ACMA's regulatory functions, and so we are prepared to leave this aspect of the hobby to the amateur radio community. But they do say we are retaining the practice where, when a new call sign is issued, it will reflect the licensee's state or territory of residence. And when changing their state or territory of residence, amateurs can apply for a new call sign if they want. But it's all up to them. So this was the ACMA taking a very hands-off approach to call signs in relation to geographic identifiers. Not quite as hands-off as originally proposed by AMC, but still, over time, it will mean that VK amateurs, especially those who move interstate, may not necessarily take up the number of the state they're moving to. So there'll be a variation of VK2 in future, will not necessarily always be based in New South Wales. Really depends on what amateurs do with changing their call signs, noting that to change a call sign does incur an extra charge. Now on the 1st of October, we come to more correspondence on Scout and Guide call signs. Initially, AMC wanted to simplify it, so having no special Scout and Guide call signs. Then a compromise arrangement that Glenn Dunstan has been talking about to Martin over at AMC, suggesting that there be fewer of them, particularly for Scouts, which had a lot more call sign blocks than Guides. So they wanted to narrow that just down to 26 call signs per state. And so Glenn Dunstan suggested that to ACMA, but ACMA didn't find that convincing at all. And they then went to look to see how many spare amateur call signs there were. And of course there's lots and lots of them. So there is no mathematical need to be reducing the number of Scout and Guide call signs, because we're never going to run out of call signs. You would need a huge explosion in the amateur population to do so. The other thing is that ACMA had expected that AMC would consult with the Scouts, whereas AMC's advisor Glenn Dunstan said no, that should be something that ACMA should do. So pretty much a stalemate there. It's not going to happen. It didn't happen. So after a brief time when the Scout call signs were removed from the prescribed call sign blocks, they were then put back in again as being Scout and Guide exclusive only. So exactly the same arrangements as applied before. I'm not sure if this was serious or someone was just curious, but in 2020 someone actually applied for the call sign VK6GGG. That of course is in the call sign block reserved for Girl Guides. Anyway, that application was rejected by AMC, as it was an individual applying for it. Now, when that rejection came about, they complained to ACMA, and the letter, for some reason the applicant was very passionate about it, and they labelled Scouts as like a powerful lobby and ACMA as inconsistent. And so they consider the Scout and Guide call reservation as unenforceable, and they even threaten possible legal action. Wow. Something else I noticed was that their letter talks about gaining the sector agreement. And I don't think too many amateurs refer to us as being the amateur sector. More often amateur hobby or amateur service, but it's a bit of jargon there. After no joy from the ACMA, the VK6GGG applicant forwarded the letter to RASA, i.e. Glenn Dunstan, its president, who then sends quite a strongly worded email to ACMA. Glenn points out what he sees as inconsistency between this and geographically based call signs, and he sees that the ACMA is ignoring amateur views. So the basic thing was that the Scouts were able to get a change to the call sign system reversed, even though the take-up of Scouts call signs is relatively small, only a fraction of amateur call signs, yet they were able to get the ACMA on board and change it, whereas amateurs that support geographically based call signs were not able to get full joy from the ACMA. They got partial joy. The ACMA took a cautious view of saying that no, if you are applying for your first call sign, then you still have to get a call sign with a number based on where you live. But they removed the requirement that was generally understood by most people to change their call sign if you moved interstate. So I think this different treatment or perception of different treatment was the basis of RASA's concern. And in relation to call sign geographic and numbering and all that, it seems to be only RASA that has been involved in the communication there. I didn't see anything from the WIA on that issue. If you want to look through all these documents for yourself, then go to the ACMA's website, or you could just Google ACMA FOI disclosure log. Log 84 is where all the documents are. A total of 66 documents, though some documents I noticed were not there. For instance, 2, 39 and 42. Also, a lot of documents had lots of black lines, so we weren't able to see what was in them. The ACMA must be fed up by now of FOI requests by amateurs, but I must admit that it has provided some interesting information that we wouldn't otherwise know, including, not least, about the organisations that purport to represent us as amateurs. So, who do you think was the most successful in getting their way? The WIA for getting the classless call signs up, RASA for trying but so far not succeeding in preserving amateur call sign numbers by state, or the Scout Association for preserving their Scouts and Guide call sign blocks. I'll let you be the judge. Dib dib dib, dob dob dob.